We are all products of our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents, those names that stretch so far back into time that they exceed the limits of modern memory. We have inherited everything from them: hair, eyes, height, names, but the most important thing we inherit is also the most intangible: their stories and our own sense of personal history. The oral tradition has existed for thousands of years and is what connects us to a broader world history and to each other. With the rise of technology, it appears that storytelling between family members has become an increasingly lost art. To salvage my own personal family history, I decided to reconnect with my grandmother, Mary Ann Wright, and explore her story in the context of 20th century American history. This is her story. It is full of hard work, love, loss, hope, and most of all, resilience. It is a typical American story, complete with humble beginnings from a small town in rural Pennsylvania, adversity and the loss of a husband, and a fierce independence embodied in her 3 daughters. Mary Ann Spangler was born on October 23, 1934, to James and Margaret Spangler at a hospital 7 miles from their home in Mount Joy, Pennsylvania.
Well, of course, my parents met at Penn State.
Mm-hmm.
My mother came from a predominantly German heritage. Her father was a carpenter, and he worked for the university at Penn State. And because he worked for the university, my mother was given tuition there. And my father was a big playboy. His family was Scotch-Irish, and their family was predominantly from Marietta, and they were big bankers, and Bar Spangler is on one of the bank currency things from the 1800s. Anyway, the bottom line is that they had lots of money.
While James was an engineering major and Margaret was a liberal arts major, they both crossed paths at social functions such as fraternity parties. Margaret and James graduated Penn State in 1932 and married shortly after the following year in January of 1933. During this time period, it was incredibly rare that one parent, let alone both parents, would go to college. In 1950, in Lancaster County, only 3 to 6.1% of residents had completed college. It was even rarer for women to have completed college, with only 0 to 5.1% of women in Lancaster County having a college degree. Mary Ann's parents settled down in Marietta, Pennsylvania, and then moved to Mount Joy, Pennsylvania when Mary Ann was 6. Mount Joy was a town of 3,000 people, about 60 miles west of Philadelphia. The community was mostly rural, with a large population of farmers and evangelical Mennonites who integrated with the community at large.
So Mount Joy was a pretty small community, and with most of the families being farmers, very few of the families were what you would call had the advantage of having college degrees, other than the little bank in town and things like that. So it was a simple life. There were a lot of what we called plain order Mennonites, and they wore the little white bonnets, and they were the next sect, I guess you would say, up from the strict Amish. And they did not believe in dancing. There were no, they wore the aprons. They did have buttons on their clothes, because a lot of Amish were not allowed to have any buttons or things like that. I'm not sure how they fastened their aprons, but there was nothing worldly about the Mennonites that I went to school with.
These Mennonites can be traced from the earliest inhabitants of Pennsylvania, a state founded on the idea of religious freedom. 10,000 Germans immigrated to this area in the 18th century in order to flee persecution from the French. 2,500 of these German immigrants were Mennonites and settled in the cheap lands of western Pennsylvania, particularly in Lancaster County and the area surrounding Mount Joy. Due to the small size of the community and the strong Pennsylvanian belief in religious tolerance, there was no animosity or division between the Mennonites and the rest of the Mount Joy community. In 1929, Mount Joy was hit by the Depression, and it had lasting effects on the town. Although both of Mary Ann's parents were college graduates, they were unable to find jobs, and James was forced to open up a gas station, which he managed until 1941. As a result of the Depression, Mary Ann's family grew up poor and without many luxuries.
My mother, for instance, I remember she had like 3 babies after me, and she had the same dress that she wore over and over and over. I got so I guess it would be called a house dress or slash maternity dress. I made most of my own clothes. We you can't even find patterns. That was the big thrill, is to go to the fabric store and pick out material and find patterns to make clothes from. Well, nobody does that anymore.
That's so
to begin with, if the material, by the time you buy the material to make it, it's cheaper to go out and buy it.
James was rejected from military service due to his age of 32, so he continued to manage the station until he found a job working at a local RCA plant in Lancaster, developing cathode ray tubes for their eventual use in television screens. Although he was rejected from military service due to his age, James was able to support the war effort in other ways, such as working for the Army Engineering Corps in Washington. Mary Ann was only a little girl, but she remembers the war vividly.
Well, yeah, we saved all the aluminum foil and put it into balls and sold it. I'm just laughing. You just saved everything. And we had rationing. We had food stamps that we could only get so much meat given out to us. I'd go stand in line with my mother at the butcher shop till we got our meat. But nobody went without. And then we used to have blackouts, and we used to have a guy across the street who was a bachelor, and he used to hang around the lamppost every time there was a blackout, and he'd sing for my mother. He had a crush on my mother. He'd sing "Egg of My Heart."
The 1944 GI Bill drastically increased military participation. The bill offered benefits such as dedicated payments of tuition and living expenses to attend high school, college, or vocational school, low-cost mortgages, and low-interest loans to start a business.
That's what happened to Nancy Kepler. Her husband was interrupted in his college. He was drafted out of college and was into the military, but then he went back and finished up after he got out of the Army. And I think that's what a lot of them did, particularly at Penn State. They had to build all these temporary buildings and dorms for all the returning servicemen.
During this time, Mary Ann's mother took a job as a social worker, placing local children into permanent homes.
She was working at a local factory in some sort of administrative job beginning, I guess, when I was in 8th or 9th grade. And then when I left home, she went to work for Lancaster County for social work department and was placing children with different families. Most of them at that time were Amish. Not the children, but the children that she was placing, she would put with Amish families. So
James was an active member of the community.
my father was, and we went to the Presbyterian Church on a regular basis. I think my father was an elder at one point. Just as he was active, he would belong to the town council in Mountjoy. He was a member of the Lions Club.
Margaret had 3 babies following Mary Ann, but none of them survived. It wasn't until the late 1940s that science had discovered the cure. Her mother was Rh negative, and only with complete blood transfusions upon childbirth could they save the baby. Growing up, Mary Ann was a tomboy who played tag, kicked the can, and jackknife with all the neighborhood boys. Her best friend was named Sally and lived 1 block away. Mary Ann joined Girl Scouts at the age of 10, with her mother serving as the Girl Scout troop leader. Girl Scouts served as a social hub for Mary Ann and the rest of her classmates.
Girl Scouts with me started when I went to Girl Scout camp, I guess, when I was 10. And we took a trip to Montreal one time, and my mother drove. This was our scout trip. Mother had a brownie troop. She never had me in Scouts. She was with a brownie troop that met, I remember, at the Presbyterian Church. And because I, at that time, was too old to be in brownies, I was in a scout troop with primarily most of the girls that were in high school with me. So we had a very, very close knit, there'd probably be about 10 of us, I guess, that enjoyed scouting, and we were cheerleaders and did a lot of stuff.
Mountjoy High School was the kind of school where everyone knew each other and got along.
We had to be there at 8 or 8:30 in the morning. I know that. And
Okay.
then we'd have to walk home for lunch.
Yes. Okay.
And so we were there from 12. We had lunch from 12 to 1. Mm-hmm. And I think if I recall, it was like at 3:30 we got out. I mean, there was no consolidation, so those same 52 were the same people that I went through school from on with. And then the girls had to take home ec and the boys had to take shop.
That's funny.
But yeah, in gym we would play basketball, and the girls at that time could only play. If you were a forward, you could only play half the court, and if you were a guard, you could only stay in the other half of the court. It was crazy. But they had basketball and gymnastics, but the big thing was field hockey. I played a lot of field hockey.
Mary Ann was one of only 3 girls in her high school class to take academic courses such as physics.
My parents were both college graduates, and there was never a doubt that I was going to go to college in one way. I mean, that was just accepted, whereas most of the other kids, very few of them had parents that were college graduates.
Mm-hmm. Her and the other 54 students in her class spent their afternoons at the drugstore downtown and at the movies.
The big movie thing was Bud Abbott and Lou Costello and Tarzan. Now, that was when I was 8 years old. And then by the time I got to college, it was Jimmy Dean and Marlon Brando. And, they were the two that stick out in my mind. 3D was quite a thing. They had 3D glasses, actually, back in the 50s when I was in college. Wow. But when I was in Mountjoy, I don't remember going to, just those lighthearted films like Bud Abbott, Lou Costello, and Tarzan. I used to go to all the Tarzan pictures with Johnny Weissmuller.
The golden age of television lasted from 1947 to 1960. In 1950, only 9% of Americans had television sets in their households. With the rise of color television and mass production in the 50s, television sets became increasingly popular and accessible to the American public. Mary Ann remembers watching the television downtown at the general store.
Well, it wasn't until after we used to go over to Grandpa Spangler's store and watch Sid Caesar on Sunday night, and that was when I was in high school, but they never had their own TV set until after I left home, which was after 52. And Grandpa Spangler he was selling them, and he had the one TV that was apparently for the whole town to show in the store. So we'd go over and sit in the store and watch TV. His general store had a record counter, and that was my big thrill. I'd go over there and play records all Saturday afternoon.
Mary Ann worked one summer picking potatoes and another working in a handkerchief factory around the corner from where she lived. Mary Ann was one of only 3 girls in her graduating high school class to attend college. She chose Penn State University for its inexpensive in-state tuition and because it had become a family tradition, if not an expectation. While at Penn State, Mary Ann joined the sorority Kappa Delta.
The sorority at Penn State was not like most sororities. They did not have a sorority house. Mm-hmm. Each sorority had a small suite where they had a piano and a place where we all played bridge, and it was usually surrounded by the rooms, maybe 10 rooms. They did that. Of course, that was back in the days when there was no integrated student buildings, in other words, dorms. They were all either for women or all for men.
Mary Ann decided to major in food sciences and become a dietitian after being inspired by her aunt who did the same thing.
I took a lot of chemistry. It's what I remember that I hated the most of anything, and graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree. And because I took so many chemistry classes, and I was majoring at that time in it was in nutrition that was in the College of Home Economics. And because I took the nutrition hoping I was going to someday be a dietitian, it was required. I had ag biochem, I had chemistry every single semester up to the day I graduated. And you had some classes like lectures with 300 to 500 people in a class. I mean, Penn State, even back then, there were 3,200 in the freshman class, so some of the classes were quite large because there weren't that many different curriculums. But there weren't that many opportunities back then. You could either be a home economics teacher, or a general teacher, or at one time I wanted to work for one of the power companies, PP&L, for instance, in Pennsylvania, where you'd go out and give demonstrations on food. So there just weren't that many things to do for if you were a woman.
While in college, Mary Ann spent her summers at Ocean City working as a waitress with some of the other girls from her sorority Kappa Delta.
I worked at a place called Chris's Restaurant, and I lived with 6 other sorority sisters, primarily from Penn State in Ocean City, New Jersey.
In spite of the time that has passed, Ocean City has remained very similar to how it was back when Mary Ann worked there in the 50s.
I think it's probably quite almost the same, because Ocean City was basically a dry community, and it still is in New Jersey. And then there was a place across the causeway that was called Summers Point, where they were allowed to serve liquor. And even though none of us were 21, it seemed that everybody went over there, and it was the beginning of rock and roll, and it was a crazy time to be at Summers Point, because there was a guy there called Mike Pedersen, and that was when that song came out, rock and roll. And everybody was jitterbugging. It was the end of the Glenn Miller big band sound, and then they got into suddenly everybody was doing the twist and rock and roll, and it was still before the Beatles, because the Beatles I don't think came into existence until the early '60s. So this was the transition between the big band and the Beatles, so to speak, and it was fun.
Her sophomore year of college, Mary Ann was escorted to the May Court by a blind date set up by her friends. Her date's name was David Irvin Wright, a midshipman visiting Penn State from the Naval Academy for a golf tournament. The two fell in love, in spite of the fact that David was already engaged, and kept up a correspondence throughout college, visiting each other whenever possible.
The May Day activities at Penn State, and one of my friends knew a midshipman who was there on a golf trip. They were playing against Penn State. Navy was playing against Penn State, and they said, would I like to go with this nice-looking man? I said, midshipman, and I said, of course. And I remember it was Mother's Day, too, because he called his mother and wished him a happy Mother's Day, so that weekend. I was very impressed. Well, David was into, as any of my daughters will tell you, he was into hunting and fishing. It almost occupied his entire life, and when he wasn't doing that, he was playing golf. The story that we remember so vividly is when we used to go to Florida, because that's where his parents lived, and he brought a group of his Air Force buddies to Florida to go fishing. And there's a fish in Florida called a snook that is a prize capture if you can possibly pull it out of the water. And he had looked and looked, fished, and finally one of his good friends pulled it out. He had never forgotten that, because after all his longing to get a snook, and one of his friends who had never fished before ended up capturing it. So.
Dave and Mary Ann were engaged in 1955 at the age of 21, and married shortly after in 1957, the day after his Air Force commission from the United States Naval Academy.
We were married the day after his graduation on June the 8th of 1957. David did not want to get married at the academy, so we chose to be married at Donegal Presbyterian Church and just outside of Mount Joy. I think the actual address is Donegal Springs, Pennsylvania. And the reception was at home at our house, and it poured all day. Absolutely. We went to for our honeymoon, we went to Colorado Springs as a member of the part of the golf team at the Naval Academy. That year they had done very well, and all the members of the golf team were being sent to Colorado Springs for the NCAA finals. And so David and I took advantage of the money that was offered for his transportation out and back to make that our honeymoon, so to speak.
At that time, the Navy was accepting 25% of the graduating class into the Air Force, and David decided to join.
What he told me is that he desperately wanted to fly, and that he did not want to fly on a postage stamp, translated to mean that he didn't want to fly onto a carrier. They took 25% of every graduating class from West Point and Annapolis to the Air Force, because that was before the first graduating class from the Air Force Academy. And then they kept all those people together. We were assigned, our first assignment was in Montgomery, Alabama for like several weeks of indoctrination, so to speak. And so the whole class, I remember it was called 59B, because that's when his graduation at that time would be in as a qualified pilot. He would have been in 1959. So the class of pilots were all military academy people, which was rather interesting, if not unique, because there was always a big rivalry between Navy and Army, so it was a fun time too.
While stationed at the Air Force, over 13 years of military service took them to Oklahoma, Arizona, Florida, Atlanta, Turkey, Germany, and finally Las Vegas.
He just was into different planes. For the first 2 years, that's all he did was upgrade in one airplane to another. He started out with just a basic trainer and ended up flying. We went from Montgomery, Alabama to Barstow, Florida for 6 months. Then we went to Arizona for 6 more months, and then we went to Enid, Oklahoma for what we thought was going to be 6 months. And then Dave was assigned permanently as a flight training instructor in Enid. So we were there for a total of 5 years, and then finally David said, I want to get out of the Air Training Command. He was tired of training other people. He wanted to fly military missions. So the only way he could do that was apply to graduate school, which he did. And then his choice of Georgia Tech was based on, it was one of the few colleges that was offered that was not a military sponsored program. In other words, it was all civilians that went there as a member of the Air Force. It was not an Air Force acclaimed, recognized school, so to speak. So we spent a year and a half at Georgia Tech, and then I was very upset because he wanted to get out and fly, so he accelerated his program, and he was getting a master's in engineering. And so he accelerated, and he got orders to be assigned to headquarters in Europe. But when the orders came down, they said Turkey, and my first reaction was, David, Turkey's not in Europe. But anyway, that's how we spent a year and a half in Atlanta, and then we went on to Turkey.
During this time period, Marianne and David also had their 3 children, Sharon in 1960, Susie in 1962, and Shelley in 1964, completing their goal of having children by the time they were 30. Marianne kept busy by playing tennis, golf, and raising the three girls. This peaceful existence was abruptly interrupted in 1962 when the Cold War reached its climax with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States faced a tense standoff with the Soviet Union over their storage of missiles in Cuba, and nuclear war seemed imminent. Due to their many military connections, Marianne and David had a unique perspective during this event.
Well, now that happened back in Enid, Oklahoma, when Tom and David and I were in pilot training, and we had a very good friend down the street, and Mary's father at that time was editor of the Washington Post. And so when we were there during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Mary had received a phone call the day that she was coming over to our house for dinner and bridge, that her father was calling to wish her goodbye, because as he was convinced with the news that he had been gathering at the Washington Post that the United States was going to be bombed to the point of almost out of existence. So that was a very chilling time.
Dave's military career took them all over the country and over the world, including to Turkey, where they lived for many months.
When we were there, it was a smoggy, smoke-filled city, and everywhere you went, you could smell. They had the samovars, and it was truly things you look primitive, like in the movies. They all wore Turkish dress. The ladies. Well, now we were in the capital city of Ankara, but the people, let's call them peasants for lack of another term, but they wore the long skirts and the pantaloons under it, and Sharon used to take a pride in lifting up our maid's skirt to find out what she had on underneath. And of course, they were still using the squat toilet kind of thing, and plumbing was open, and we had to have our water chlorinated. We had to go put chlorine in our water in order to drink it. And all that had changed by the time we went back.
Mm-hmm. Living abroad while trying to juggle three young girls was not always easy.
Oh, they were a handful. Sharon started school when we were in Turkey. She went to kindergarten, and then when we were in Germany, Susie, I guess, was in first grade. She must have gone on to 5th grade before we left. And Shelley, of course, was like just a baby. When we went over to Turkey, she was only 6 months old, so she'd been about 3 when we got home. But they were just normal kids. David took Sharon out, and they spent a lot of time shooting skeet, and he'd never had a boy, so he was trying to teach her how to shoot a gun. And they were really too little when he was around, and then growing up, they were very active young ladies, to say the least.
Marianne and her family watched from afar in Turkey as the United States was ripped apart by racial tension during the Civil Rights Movement.
Getting the news in Germany, it sounded like the entire United States was going up in flames because of all the racial tensions. We were just so immune to all that because we were away now, and of course it wasn't until we came back that, of course, by that time, everybody was just mad. But then when we came back, it was when Wallace was shot and Martin Luther King was shot. And of course, Tom, interestingly, was living in Alexandria across from a housing project which had a lot of minorities. And so it was a difficult time. It was a very difficult time. Even when we were in Las Vegas, it was amazing. Now, there were a lot of racial tensions in Las Vegas. I don't know if Shelley or any of the girls remember, but there were stories circulating that a lot of particularly the blacks, were dangerous, carried knives. I mean, nobody seemed to be as quick with a gun back then as they are today, but there were a lot of fires and a lot of crime. Racial.
The Vietnam War began in 1955 following the rise to power of Communist leader Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. The war became immersed in controversy during the 60s, with anti-war protests popping up in cities and on college campuses, the most famous being University of California, Berkeley. As a military pilot, David had no choice but to volunteer for a one-year tour in Vietnam, or else have many promotions put on hold.
He did not relish the thought of going to Vietnam. As a matter of fact, he waited until the very last minute until they told him that unless you volunteered, you would not get promoted. So that's when he finally volunteered, so to speak, whereas most of his friends had already been there and come back.
During the war, David was a member of the 432nd Tactical Reconnaissance Wing stationed at Udorn Royal Thai Air Force Base in Thailand. Their mission was to provide intelligence about hostile forces through tactical reconnaissance and use fighter elements to destroy targets earmarked by the intelligence data provided. The 432nd accounted for more than 80% of all reconnaissance activity over North Vietnam during the war.
Well, yeah, his job was taking reconnaissance. He just flew a plane with cameras. No guns, no nothing. I mean, he if it wasn't taking pictures of so-called prison camps, he was taking pictures of enemy positions that possibly might exist.
Yeah.
Or artillery in the area, that kind of thing.
In spite of the protests that were happening nationwide, Marianne and David maintained their faith in their government and saw participation in the war as their duty.
David, in particular, you know, when you're in the military, you do what the military tells you to do, and you don't question the political motives behind it. Particularly at that time, you had still had a lot of faith in your government. Of course, since then, so much has been written about the logic of Vietnam and how it started and how we got there, but you can't go back and change history. It is what it is, and you can't spend your life dwelling or reflecting on what was and what could be.
On the morning of November 13th, 1970, exactly 11 months and 13 days from the start of his tour, Dave's plane was shot down over North Vietnam, and he was killed in action. It was Friday the 13th, and he was filling in for someone who had overslept. Their mission that day was to gather intelligence on a nearby POW camp with the hope of rescuing the American prisoners inside. He was due to return home in 2 weeks, and it was 3 days before his oldest daughter, Sharon's birthday. However, his death was not in vain. As a result, the North Vietnamese caught on to the fact that the Americans were watching and began to treat their POWs much better, improving the quality of life for American prisoners. The family was devastated after David's death, and the next few months were an extraordinarily emotional time. Marianne was left a single mother with 3 young daughters and no source of income other than the $20,000 government life insurance policy.
Yeah, I mean, when David was shot down, the government life insurance policy at that time had just been raised from $10,000 to $20,000, and that was the sum total of what I received, which at that time did seem like a lot, but when I suddenly realized that I had no income coming in at all, other than I did get Social Security and a small VA pension.
Eventually, she decided to pick up the girls and move to Virginia, where the girls would qualify for free in-state tuition if they attended a public university. They moved to Yorktown in April of 1971 with the help of several friends stationed at Langley Air Force Base.
And we moved to an apartment while we were waiting for our house to be built, and the kids would go down to the little docks that they had there. And at that time, they were like 6, 8, and 10. And I guess the neighbors or somebody must have shown them how to catch crabs by tying a string around a chicken neck, throwing it in the water. That was my first revelation to welcome to the East Coast crabbing region.
Marianne found a job working as a hostess at Colonial Williamsburg, which allowed her to be home most of the time with the family. The training process was intensive but highly enjoyable.
Well, it was a several year training program. You started there with spent like 3 or 4 months learning the social life, where we studied George Wythe and Randolph, the Randolph family. He was president of the Continental Congress. And then we went from there and spent several more months with the craftsmen, such as the GIRI. He was the silver person, and other people, the hat shop or whatever. And then we went from there to, I guess, the palace, and we spent a long time on the palace, where we had to learn all the monarchs and the line of succession in England. And then finally, we spent at least 6 months on the Capitol, where we studied English law. And most of the people then were older, and I would say well-educated women who had never worked in any kind of professional capacity, simply because a lot of them didn't have an opportunity to do that. And in any event, these women were paid by minimum wage, and we were called interpreters. I guess now you would refer to them as docents. And they lived the world of colonial times. They truly did. I mean, we wore the costumes, the dresses, and really lived as though it was 1800s, 1700s.
In 1974, a huge scandal shook Colonial Williamsburg when Fawn Brodie published her book, Thomas Jefferson, An Intimate History, and Jefferson's sexual relationship with his slave Sally Hemings became known to the American public.
Yeah, well, there was Sally Hemings was, of course, Thomas Jefferson's mistress, and the book had just been written about her by Fawn Brodie, and it was entitled, I guess, Thomas Jefferson. It was one of the first revelations, and certainly not the last, but we always had, as we called ourselves, hostesses then, and we would have downtime between tours. And I remember the lady coming down the stairs at the Randolph house saying, "Guess what the latest is? Thomas Jefferson had a mistress." And that's when I decided it was time to leave Colonial Williamsburg and try to find something else. Because there had to be another world other than the one I was living
in the 1700s.
The other thing was that being a hostess on call, as I was, because particularly during the summer months, the girls were I had no help or anyone at home, so I tried to be home as much as I could. But then they being Colonial Williamsburg, would call on me for every holiday, and on the book that they needed me to work, and also they wanted me to work all weekends and this kind of thing. So I got all the jobs that nobody else, or I worked the days rather that nobody else wanted to work.
Following Colonial Williamsburg, Mary Ann found a job as a part-time volunteer coordinator for Meals on Wheels, working with older adults in the Williamsburg area. She received the job largely because of her college degree in nutrition, which many women her age did not have.
Yeah, I was a volunteer coordinator in so many words. in Williamsburg for part-time. That was my first leap afterward, when I think I worked like 5 days a week, just 4 or 5 hours time, and recruiting seniors into volunteer positions. And I guess then it led from there to, for me, applying to the nutrition director job at Peninsula Agency on Aging, which was Meals on Wheels.
In the year 2000, Marianne connected with an old military friend of hers and Dave's named Tom Galbraith, whose wife had died since.
How did you know each other
Tom
originally?
and David, of course, were both Naval Academy graduates, and I don't know where they met each other, but somewhere along the line they did. And Tom had mentioned the chaplain's tour to the Holy Land to David, and so we said, oh, that sounds great. For $50 we could spend 3 or 4 days in Jerusalem, etc. And so that was the first time I met him, when we went on that trip.
Mm-hmm.
And then he would invite us after we got back. He would invite us on he was assigned to the embassy in Turkey. Tom was. He was the assistant naval attaché.
Oh wow, that sounds so cool.
And so he would invite us to all these fancy functions, which we got a kick out of.
Tom and Marianne fell in love and were shortly married in the year 2002.
We were married in Jamestown Church, and there were 6 little girls there. Yeah, it was and they had a harpsichord, and it was a very nice wedding.
With her marriage to Tom, Marianne also inherited a house in the Bahamas and a new traveling companion to go on adventures with her. Since their marriage, they have traveled the world extensively to every continent except Africa and Antarctica. They now live in Amelia Island, Florida with their schnoodle Roxy, and spend their time traveling the world and visiting their many grandchildren. The question of the American dream has been debated for centuries among scholars. How do you define it? Is it still alive? Did it ever exist? To me, the definition is simple. It is the hope that through hard work and determination, we can provide better lives for our children. We inherit the American dream from our loved ones. I see it every day when I look in the face of my grandmother. It runs through our veins and through our hearts, reminding us of their sacrifices, our own hopes, and what it means to be an American.